begin with rare best systems in a lawless world.
Thank you all for coming, in spite of fire alarm. Let me start off by thanking Matt, because a year ago he gave an earlier version of his paper on lawlessness at a conference in Italy. And we started talking, this paper kind of grew out of that. So, best systems in a lawless world is kind of going off in a different direction than Matt did. So the thesis I want to defend in this paper is that David Lewis's best system account of laws of nature finds laws in lawless worlds, and that this is a problem for the best system account. Let me start by reminding you of some of the salient features of the best systems account. So the best systems account is a regularity view of law. It's a view that identifies the laws of nature with actual regularities rather than with some underlying features that generate or govern these regularities. And with any regularity theory of lawhood, BSA must meet the challenge of distinguishing the accidental regularities in the world from the law-like ones. And the way that BSA wants to identify the law-like regularities is model on scientific theories, scientific practices of theory reduction. So in general, scientists tend to regard the regularity as accidental if it can be reduced to other regularities plus some particular matters of fact. For example, think about the regularities of the phase of the moon. Typically, people don't stipulate an additional fundamental moon phase law because these regularities can be reduced to the general laws of motion plus some specific facts about the masses of the moon and the Earth and the initial position, velocity, and so on. So the basic idea of BSA is to identify the law-like regularities in the world with those regularities that remain once this process of theory reduction is run its course. That's the basic idea. But it can't be the whole story. One immediate complication is that any regularity can be reduced to a list of its instances. So if we reduce regularities as much as possible, we would just end up with a long list of particular facts, not with a theory. The way Lewis wants to resolve this problem is in the following way. He thinks that in thinking of best scientific theory, we need to balance the competing virtues of strength and simplicity. So in the case of the moon phase law, by adding a moon phase law would increase strength in that we don't have to include also the specific information about the moon and the Earth, but we reduce simplicity because we now have a more complicated theory. So the idea is that what we do in scientific theory is we balance these two competing demands. A very nice illustration of how that is supposed to work is by Helen Beatty. It's God's Big Book of Facts. Suppose God wanted to tell us all the truths about the world in one big book. Then one thing he could do is list all the particular facts. But in that way, the book would be too long and too unwieldy to be of much use to us. So God, being a nice guy, does something a little bit different. He splits the big book into two parts. In part A, he lists a number of general axioms, regularities about the world, in a compact list of general principles, and he then provides the rest of the information in part B as a longish list of particular facts. Now, you can think of the system of God's big book of facts of consisting just of the axioms in part A. The simplicity to first approximation can be measured just by how many axioms you have in part A. And the strength of the system is measured by the number of facts in part B that part A renders redundant. So in writing the big book of facts, God needs to strike a balance between strength and simplicity. Then you can add more axioms to part A, but that would reduce simplicity. You can add fewer ones, but then that would reduce strength. So he has to kind of balance something, and has to balance these competing demands. And of course, God strikes the best balance between these competing demands. But very roughly, the best balance is one that keeps both parts of the big book of facts as short as possible. That's it. So the idea of the best system account is that science aspires to the ideal of God's big book of facts. As Lewis puts it, a law of nature is any regularity that earns inclusion in the ideal system. This account is ultimately inspired by a remark by Frank Ramsey, who says that even if we knew everything, we should still want to systematize our knowledge in a deductive system, and the general axioms in that system would be the fundamental laws of nature. Now, there's a lot of discussion about this proposal, and there are a number of familiar objections to the best system account. For example, BSA does not tell us how to measure the simplicity of an individual regularity. Now, I said we measure the simplicity of system by the number of axioms in part A of the book. You might say, well, how about I just take the conjunction of some of the axioms, reduces the number of axioms, but it doesn't really reduce the wisdom. It also doesn't really tell us how to measure, how to balance simplicity and the seemingly incommensurable feature of strength. And it does not tell us what to say when two systems are tied. Lewis's response to these concerns is that he hopes that none of this matters. He says, if nature is kind, then the best system will be robustly best and come out first under any standards of simplicity and strength and balance. So of course, keeping these matters in suspense clearly works in favor of BSA, because if BSA gets to retrofit standards of strength and simplicity and balance, then there's always a story you can tell after the fact about how scientists arrived at the theories they had by balancing strength and simplicity in this particular manner. So it's hard to kind of object to BSA in this way. Now these familiar objections all claim that BSA could fail to find laws in a world like ours where there are laws to be found. I want to raise a different objection that I don't think is brushed aside that easily. I want to argue that BSA finds laws in lawless worlds, where there aren't any. Okay, what's a lawless world? We saw that a little bit in that talk. So let me start from a slightly different point. Nelson Goodman's view that laws of nature, law-like regularities, must support counterfactual conditionals. Basically, the idea is, suppose it's a law that all X are G's. And suppose A is neither F nor G, that if this regularity is law-like, then it must be true that this A, if it were F, would be G. And the idea here is that not all laws, not all regularities succeed in doing that. Goodman's example is, all the coins in Goodman's pocket on VE Day are silver. So VE Day is Victory in Europe Day, because my people lost the war. For those of you who are too young to remember that. So that this regularity is not law-like because it's false that if you were to put a copper coin into Goodman's pocket on that day, it would turn to silver. He doesn't have a magic silver-making pocket. So I would say that a world is lawless if there are no counterfactual dependencies between different properties and instantiations in that world. In a lawless world, stuff just happens. And what happens in one place imposes no constraints whatsoever on all the other places. Okay. Now here, I appeal to Goodman, and Goodman thinks that this connection between laws and counterfactuals, that's the key to an account of law. Lewis clearly doesn't think that. He thinks that the key to understanding laws is that purely logical work they do in shortening the big book of facts. So he doesn't start out at this point, but he thinks that his account will give it to you. And he offers a proof that BSA laws support counterfactual conditionals. Here's how this goes. First of all, he has an account of counterfactual conditionals. Counterfactual is true just in case the closest in the world most similar to ours, in which the antecedent is true, the consequent is true. This does not mention the laws of nature, which only enter indirectly in the similarity relation between possible worlds. So Lewis claims that BSA laws are highly informative about their worlds, and that a difference in law makes for a big difference between worlds. So, the world most similar to ours, in which A is F, is bound to be one in which all F's are G's is still a law. Hence, A is G in that world. That's how laws of nature are supposed to support counterfactual. Keep that little proof in your mind, we're going to come back to that. Okay, so, what's the problem of lawless worlds? Well, lawless worlds can still exhibit accidental regularities, just by happenstance. Not because of the laws, it just happens that way. In that case, theory reduction would begin and end with these accidental regularities, which BSA would falsely classify as law-like. That is, in a lawless world, accidental regularities end up in part A of the Big Book of Facts by default, for lack of better alternatives. So BSA finds laws in lawless worlds, but there aren't any. Now, I want to discuss two ways of getting around this problem: the language requirement and the strength threshold. Now, here's something I want to grant as a fact: that in a lawless world, you can only find pervasive regularities of the form all F's are G's if either F or G are gerrymandered predicates. In a different context, Lewis addresses something like this concern in that he notes that BSA is bound to be trivial if you admit gerrymandered predicates. So he notes that any set of truth S can be axiomatized with a single axiom, all F's are G's, where F applies to everything and G applies to all and only things at worlds where S holds. To address this, he suggests imposing a language requirement that the primitive vocabulary that appears in the axioms refer only to perfectly natural properties. That's the language requirement. So, what's good about the language requirement is that it rules out Goodman's pocket regularity. It's a gerrymandered predicate being in his pocket and being there. What's bad is that lawless worlds can still exhibit minor accidental regularities that only involve perfectly natural properties. That's we're not going to get pervasive ones, we're going to get minor ones. And the minor ones would still count as law-like because there aren't any other regularities to which they would be reduced. You might think, well, can't we just bite the bullet? That is, we just accept the minor regularities in these lawless, what I call lawless worlds, as law-like because they do what Ramsey claims laws do. They show it in the Big Book of Facts. The problem with that is that minor regularities are not highly informative about the worlds in which they are obtained. They're equivalent to a small cluster of facts. So they don't support counterfactuals via Lewis's proof. So I'm not quite sure that biting the bullet is going to be a promising response for BSA. But let's hold off on that and let me look at a different way of responding to the problem. That's the strength threshold, which is something that already came up in Max talk. The strength threshold objects not to the way regularities in lawless worlds are described, but it latches onto the fact that they're minor. So if you think about doing this strength-simplicity trade-off, the cost, the simplicity cost of counting any regularity as law-like is always the same. It increases the number of axioms by 1. However, the strength benefit depends on how pervasive the regularity is. That is, for the same simplicity cost, a minor regularity offers a very, very small strength benefit. And that suggests, again, something that was working back on that, that built into the BSA account, there's a strength threshold for lawhood. Some regularities do not have enough instances to count as BSA laws. Now, where precisely that threshold is, depends on what precisely you say about strength, simplicity, and balance, and Lewis never tells us where it is, but there's going to be some sort of threshold like that in our account. And isn't that enough to deal with the problem? That is, here's what's good about the strength threshold. For one, it's not an additional thing that you add to BSA like the language requirement. It's there already. What's nice about it, for example, it rules out Goodman's pocket regularity, assuming they have like a lot of concepts. It also rules out minor regularities in lawless worlds because they don't have enough instances to pass the strength threshold. And also guarantees that, seems to guarantee that laws are highly informative because those minor regularities, they don't qualify as laws. To be a law, you have to be pervasive regularity, so you have to say a lot about the world. So that's all nice. But there are two drawbacks. One is that it rules out possible worlds with sparsely instantiated laws. And that includes some of the possible worlds that physicists like to talk about. A world that contains nothing but a proton and an electron, right? Hydrogen atom. A world that contains nothing but two-point masses, the two-body Roman in classical mechanics, and so on. If there is a strength threshold, then some worlds cannot contain any laws just because too little is happening in these worlds. And you think that's a little bit weird. Another problem is that it also rules out vacuous laws in the actual world. Because whatever the strength threshold is going to be higher than 0. So if you think one of the desiderata on count of law is that it admits vacuous laws, you might not want to have the strength threshold. So now let me kind of keep that in suspense. What I want to do now is present you with a way of finding laws in lawless worlds that satisfy both the language requirement and the strength threshold. To do that, we have to let go of a philosophical myth that so far we have taken for granted. And the myth is that laws of nature are about co-instantiations of natural properties, and they always take the form all F's and G's. David Archer, in his book about laws, he says that, well, it does not seem likely that many laws have this form. But then he goes on to propose a view that assumes that they all do. Right? I think that none of them do. So, if you ask physicists for an example of a law of nature, they invariably cite fundamental force laws. So, Richard Feynman, in his book, Laws of Nature, he said, well, the paradigm example is Newton's law of gravitation. So, to remind us all about it, it goes, so suppose we have two masses, M1 and 2, then location x1 and x2. If you're in that situation, then M1 accelerates towards M2 with a value given by Newton's law of gravity. So it's like basically in the square law, G is the gravitational constant. That's how one accelerates towards 2. That's Newton's force law. Now, as Nancy Cartwright pointed out, Newton's law is false, has 0 instances in any world in which there are more than 2 masses. Basically, so if there's another mass somewhere around, it's just false that M1 accelerates towards M2 with the precise acceleration given by this law. It's just false. There's 0 instances. The laws of physics lie, she says. And well, this, she's absolutely right. Now, you might want to respond. People have responded to Cartwright in the following way, and it's like, duh, vector addition. Suppose we have a bunch of masses, M1 through Mk. There are locations x1 through xk. Well, then we can do the following. We can use Newton's law to calculate the acceleration that each of the masses experiences thanks to the presence of the other masses. So the acceleration that I experience is thanks to the presence of J is given by this one, it's like the previous one with I and J instead of 1 and 2. And then what we do is we just add up, take the vector sum of all of these accelerations, and that gives us the acceleration that mass I experiences thanks to the presence of all the other masses. And that's all we need to do. Now, of course, things in real life, things are a little more complicated. There might also be charges around, and they also change their acceleration and so on. But physicists have figured out how to do all these things, how to take care of all these factors, and that's what they do when they figure out the equations of motion for a system. And what the equations of motion tell you is something like the following. Look, if properties f1 through fk are instantiated at positions x1 through xk at one time, then some properties g1 through gn are later instantiated at some other properties. As they do conditionals. Yeah, this property distribution at one time gives rise to this property distribution at another time. Well, there are many different possible property distributions to be considered. So what we have to do, we just have to pick the conjunctions of all these conditionals. That's kind of very roughly is what a law of motion, equation of motion. Plus it's super simplified because if you have the field theory, you might need to consider Beth1 many properties being instantiated in places, and kind of here suppress the fact that the G's will be instantiated at later times, or what's a time parameter, and that's also very complicated. But then to a first approximation, that's what equations of motion are. And so we think, okay, so instead of talking about Newton's force law, we should talk about these equations of motion. And I would suggest that if there are any irregularities, that's what the regularities are like. And PSA must better count these equations of motion of laws as laws of nature, because that's kind of all we got. But notice two features. First of all, think about these conditionals. An individual conditional in this long conjunction of conditionals. Ask yourself, how many non-trivial instances does it have? Well, most of these conditionals have 0 instances in the actual world because they concern property distributions that aren't actually realized. But even the ones that do have instances tend to have very few. Theory. In a deterministic world without eternal recurrence, every property distribution occurs exactly once. So these individual conditionals, they're at between 0 and 1 instances, non-trivial instances. So if you have a strength threshold, it better be that the whole long conjunction satisfies the strength threshold, not the individual conjuncts. Secondly, while all the properties might be perfectly natural, there need not be anything natural about the way they're instantiated. And that means that we can now do the following. It's like Frankenstein regularities. This can be regularity that in a lawless world satisfies the strength threshold and the language requirement. Here's how you get this Frankenstein regularity. Suppose we're given a sufficiently large lawless world. Then find all non-trivial conditionals of this form. Now even if the world is lawless, you can find a lot of them because instead of gerrymandering the properties, we gerrymander the distribution of the properties. And there's not a limit to how many different properties we can take. Here's a toy model. Think about finding regularities in the decimal expansion of pi. Then if the regularities can be of the form, if this long sequence of digits occurs, it's followed by this long sequence of digits. What is making the sequence long enough? You can find plenty of these conditionals. Regularities in the decimal expansion of pi. Most of them are only in one instance, but you can find a lot of them. So then, if you find them, then take the conjunction. That gives you a Frankenstein regularity in a lawless world that satisfies the language requirement and passes the strength threshold. Something that looks like an equation of motion. Now, unlike, you might think the Frankenstein regularities, as the name suggests, they're like Frankenstein together, out of different body parts. The equations of motion that we have aren't like that. You may think, well, it's like our equations of motion, they're kind of unified by the underlying force laws. Even though the force laws aren't laws because they're regularities, right? But there's some systematic unity to our equations of motion. That might be true that might be the reason that that laws in the actual world are equations of motion, not Frankenstein regularities. But that does not matter. In the lawless world, the Frankenstein regularities compete with regularities in that world for best system status. They don't compete with regularities in the actual world. So, in a lawless world, if it's large enough, so you get enough conditionals of this form, we get a Frankenstein regularity that satisfies the language requirement and passes the strength threshold. So even if you impose both requirements, there's going to be some Frankenstein regularity in the lawless world. Those will qualify for inclusion in the best system. So we're still going to find laws in lawless worlds. So, wrapping up, 3 minutes. Speak slowly. Wrapping up. Here's the dilemma of the PSA. Either BSA doesn't find any laws in the world described by our best physical theories because it doesn't make equations of motions as laws. Like a diluted BSA law, I think, no, metaphysicians are they're right. All F's are G's. That's what a law looks like. And this equation of motion stuff, those are laws, right? So that would be a bad result. But if you want to write bullet, you can write that bullet. Or, that's one option. BSA doesn't find laws in the actual world, bad result. BSA finds laws in some lawless worlds, and those are long enough, large enough to give you Frankenstein regularities with enough instances across the same threshold. So in that case, BSA finds laws in some lawless worlds because it has to make Frankenstein regularities in those worlds. And that actually suggests that being part of a best system is not sufficient for law. It might be a necessary requirement, it might be that, as in our theorizing, we always do something that looks a little bit like balancing strength and simplicity, but I don't think it is sufficient for law. Thank you.
Now comments from Travis McKenna.
Yeah, should I? Look, I can just.
Can you just listen?
I don't need the screen, but can I still do the podium? If I. Can I still do the podium?
Yeah.
That's okay. That's. Sorry.
You thought about that.
So thanks so much. I really like this paper. I mean, I couldn't be more on board with, amongst other things, pushing on the way that sort of like metaphysical theories of laws and their use of like instance talk is actually supposed to marry up to the way that scientific laws and practice apply to systems. I think Cartwright's more or less right on this. I think the ways he uses to push on the BSA or seem right to me and seem like pushing on. So I guess I'm just going to sort of quickly, I just have this sort of out-of-body experience when I feel like I'm sort of defend the BSA in some way. But I'm just going to try and sort of like, just try and sort of push on a couple of things that you said, Ulrich, and I'm going to try and push on sort of one like detailed thing, and I think it kind of maybe like pushes me in the direction of sort of slightly big picture, sort of dialectical worry. And so we'll see where we go. I'll try and keep it. But I don't think I'll talk about. So one thing I was thinking is, I'm not sure how explicitly you said it in the slides, but maybe more explicit in the paper, is that we call these words lawless, sort of in virtue of their lacking the kind of counterfactual dependence, characteristic of the Goodman example, say. But it seems to me that if a world is lawless in that respect, it doesn't necessarily have to be particularly random, or particularly chaotic. It just sort of seems to me, I mean, if the BSA or the Humean is thinking about laws and worlds in terms of their mosaics, it seems to me that the mosaic is the list of things that actually happen. So it seems to me that, like, there doesn't, so I think you said on the slides, it's a fact, we're going to have to gerrymander our predicates to find pervasive regularities in lawless worlds. And I kind of wasn't sure exactly why that was true. Maybe I'm thinking about it the wrong way, but it seems to me like our world, or a world with a very similar mosaic to our world, could be a lawless world in your sense. It just could be that if things happen to be different, you know, there wouldn't be the kind of connections between, the connections wouldn't obtain that we might think, but nonetheless, you know, everything that actually happens, you know, follows all the patterns that sort of our world gives us. And I was thinking that sort of, in a way, sort of strengthens your point, or maybe strengthens it in a direction that sort of leads me to my dialectical worry, because I was thinking, well, if that's true, you know, if a lawless world is one in which there's no counterfactual dependence, well, it seems like any world that has, any world that it seems sort of kosher to attribute laws to, worlds like ours, are going to have sort of counterparts where all the same stuff happens, but they just sort of lack this sort of halo of counterfactual dependence. Everything happens in perhaps the very patterned and law-like ways, or with the appearance of law-likeness in the history of the world. But it's just not true that if things had happened differently, you know, things would have sort of conformed to those patterns. So it seems like for any world W that we want, we're happy to call, you know, happy to say there are laws of that world. There's sort of like a counterpart that is sort of shares the mosaic, but doesn't have any of that counterfactual dependence that we sort of like, you know, associate with the law. So it seems in a way, and it's of course the BSA doesn't define laws of these kinds of worlds. And so I was thinking, and maybe you could help me out here if I'm getting things wrong, because there's a way in which I was worried about this, because it sort of seems to bypass all the details of the strength threshold and the language requirement. It just generates these worlds where the BSA is going to say there are laws where, you know, if counterfactual dependence is like integral to the notion of lawhood, it really ought to account for that. So that was sort of one thing I was a little puzzled about, like why we even sort of need to go through some of this machinery. It seems like if what a lawless world is for you is just something that lacks counterfactual dependence, like we can take all kinds of very ordered worlds with very ordered mosaics, right? And we can just imagine they lack this counterfactual dependence, and then we get laws in lawless worlds. But then this sort of pushed me to my dialectical worry. I was thinking, well, in that case, you know, we're calling these worlds lawless, and so it sort of rhetorically seems bad to say there are laws in lawless worlds. But now I'm kind of, if that is true, and we can generate laws in lawless worlds, sort of by the way I just described, it seems to me I'm not sure how worried, you know, I mean, obviously saying that you generate laws in lawless worlds sort of sounds bad, right? But then now I'm kind of worrying that maybe the Humean is not going to sort of buy into some part of this way of thinking about things. Because I was kind of thinking, you know, the Humean is, or that systems account, you know, which is the Humean account, is characterized at least at some level by a commitment to Humean supervenience, where two laws, if they share the same mosaic, so two worlds, if they share the same mosaic, are not going to differ in sort of these like high metaphysical ways, right? They're going to same mosaic means same laws, same mosaic means, you know, so on and so on. I was kind of thinking, well, you know, it doesn't seem to me, not being a Humean, you know, maybe I'm sort of like putting myself poorly in there, so it doesn't seem to me Humeans can be particularly happy with the idea of the idea that two worlds can share a mosaic, but nonetheless sort of differ in the kind of counterfactual dependence that they exhibit. You know, you might kind of think in this sort of Humean, Lewisian way where the notion of law and analysis of counterfactuals and causation is sort of bound up sort of these like mutually reinforcing ways that it doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense to say the two laws could share a mosaic, but nonetheless sort of differ in counterfactual dependencies that obtain that world or something like that. And counterfactual dependencies sort of a matter of when you buy possible worlds, we don't necessarily like you know, sort of we define or work our way towards a notion of counterfactual dependence or the meanings of counterfactuals or their true conditions by looking at patterns in the mosaic or something like that. And that like the fact that I can kind of just generate these like lawless counterparts to very patterned and ordered mosaics maybe is just a clue that like the idea that we can say, imagine a world with a mosaic like ours but that lacks any counterfactual dependence that ours has, maybe seems to me, at least in some vague sense, pushing on something that the Humean might not necessarily want to accept. Way of talking about counterfactual dependence across worlds. And I guess, I think I've really talked for long enough. I mean, that's sort of mostly the sort of like, and I guess I should say, it's not clear to me necessarily, even though I'm not a Humean, that the Humean would be like kind of out of order to not want to accept this way of talking. There's this very natural way of thinking about what scientists are up to that sort of goes something like this. We observe the patterns. Things obviously couldn't have been different in our world. What happens, happens, right? And so then we infer to what kind of counterfactual dependence obtains, sort of roughly speaking, in our world from the patterns that we see. And that's, in the kind of Lawlessian picture, how we get the truth conditions for counterfactual statements. And on this pretty intuitive picture, it sort of doesn't necessarily make sense to say that the direction is something like we look at the patterns and that sort of gives meaning and truth conditions to counterfactual statements. And on that picture, you can maybe, at least I feel some kind of intuitive pull to the idea that I'm not exactly sure what we're saying if we say that two worlds can have the same mosaic, but somehow not share the same patterns of counterfactual dependence or something. Or at least if you're saying that, the sort of facts about the counterfactual dependence that obtain at the world are sort of somehow more basic facts about that world that can't be sort of maybe derived from the mosaic, and that maybe those feel like, what is it, anti-Humean whatnots or something like that, that maybe Lewis or Humean is not kind of want to admit. So maybe I'm missing some of the, maybe this sort of procedure I generated, or I described for just generating lawless counterparts from otherwise ordered mosaics gets something wrong. In which case, so my big picture dialectic worry about that. But if there is something right about that, then I worry that maybe somewhere there's something baked in the dialectic that maybe the fan of the best system kind of is the Lewisian type is not going to want to accept about how we locate these facts about counterfactual dependence relative to a world in a mosaic. So anyway, that was those were my thoughts. Thanks so much.
Let me very briefly just pick up on two strands. One was the question of whether or not a world like ours, where we reach large-scale regularities, could affect the lawless world. And I think what a human would BSA would say is that their view is that it couldn't. Well, that is the idea, and I think what was kind of popping a little bit in the background is like that was generating the intuitions that it could be something. Yeah, it's a little bit like I don't know. You have some pigment, different colors. You throw it up in the air, and just by chance it lands on the floor and it looks, I don't know, like the Mona Lisa. And could our world be just like that? There doesn't be law to it. It just accidentally arranged itself in this manner. I think BSA was flat out deny that, and not only will they deny because it follows from the account of laws that that's a world with laws. They might indeed insist it's a benefit of their account that it finds laws in that case. And it's a flaw of any sort of governing account of law that might be open to a possibility that there could be this large-scale regularity in the world, but no laws. Even this Armstrong thing that we have necessitation between F's and G's. It just happens that you have a zillion F's in the world, and just by accident they're all G's. But it's not a law that all F's are G's because, I don't know, God had forgotten to kind of put the universals in that right sort of relation. So I think BSA might insist on this kind of, it's a cousin of the worry that David was doing yesterday, is that I think BSA would say, look, you have a view in which even in the total evidence limit, where you know everything, all particular facts about the world, you're in no position to know for sure whether it's a law that all F's are G's because you can't latch on to this universal end. So I think that suggestion I think BSA would reject, and I think it would be good for them to reject. The other thing that was kind of came up in that is the question: what? So I claim that there are lawless worlds, and Lewis at some point he actually considers the possibility of lawless worlds in which are all things in any causation. Do you think that BSA should just let go of that? Right? At some point they suggested, let's bite the bullet and say, look, there are laws in these worlds. And in this one, I think we must also acknowledge that law of nature is the term of art, right? And we're not going to fight over who gets to own the word law of nature. So I think if BSA wants to say that there are laws in these lawless worlds, then they can say that. Nothing will stop them. However, the problem is that in these lawless worlds, laws would no longer support counterfactuals via the mechanism spelled out by Lewis. Now Lewis might say, well, what he shows is that it's not a necessary truth that laws support counterfactuals. It won't like ours. They do. Luckily, we live in this world. There's like a sliding scale to which laws support counterfactuals. Let's say something like that. Yeah, so in these lawless worlds, what I call lawless worlds, that really are laws that just happen to support counterfactuals in that world, but in our world, thankfully, they do. Not even if you could say something like that. It's a little hard to see how to find a knockdown argument against that beyond reporting that you think that Goodman was right about a necessary condition for law, that laws must support counterfactuals, and Lewis must deny that. But I think what's interesting about this, about the equation of motion case, is how they actually support counterfactual claims. They don't support counterfactual claims via this mechanism that Lewis has. They don't support it by having a vast number of instances. You think about the equation of motion. The way equations of motion support counterfactual claims is mostly via those conditionals in that long conjunction that have zero instances. Yeah, that don't describe actual distributions of properties, but possible distributions of properties, and they tell you what would happen if properties were distributed in a different way. So in a way, the equations of motion have all those counterfactuals, they're already built into the equations of motion. And you might wonder, well, why did we include those vacuums in true conditions in the first place? Well, the reasons we introduced them is by the way we generated the laws of motion from these underlying force laws. So there's some systematic unity to it. There's something behind the equation of motion, something that governs the equation of motion, namely the force laws, the non-regularities, but somehow bring this all about. That is not included in these vacuum conditions, but kind of threaten the synthetic unity of these equations, or something like that. But you see, there we're already halfway down to a governing conception of law, and no longer regularity. So I think where I would take this next is precisely in that direction. That also hints at a larger problem with how Lewis conceives of the support the laws of nature to the contract. That's all. Thank you.
So we have about 15 minutes for Q&A.
So I want to echo Travis and have an out-of-body experience defending BSA. I don't know why I'm doing it, but terrible mistake. But first, awesome, amazing talk.
It's all thanks to the inspiration.
Enough of that. No, but so my thought is, I'm wondering whether the BSA might be defensible against the kind of dilemma you have in mind. And in fact, I was wondering about whether the BSA might be defensible on both horns of the dilemma.
Mm-hmm.
So my thought is, first, if you're like a good contemporary fan of the BSA, then you'll have more than possible worlds to appeal to in terms of which to sort of offer explanation of the kind of phenomena you're interested in explaining. And it seems to me like you could account for what happens in the kinds of small worlds you had in mind in one point of the dilemma, just in terms of certain kinds of well-behaved but incomplete, impossible worlds. And if you do that, you can account for all the kinds of things that physicists are interested in accounting for in terms of these kinds of small models without there being any kind of problem for the BSA. On the other kind of horn, it seems to me like you were assuming that conjunctions are as natural as their conjuncts, but that seems to me, if you're assuming that, to be suspicious. So for instance, that'll fail to pass Lewis's length of a perfectly natural system test, so it just can't be the case that conjunctions are as natural as their conjuncts. And if that's true, then it looks like the argument might be in trouble. And then the last thought, I'm keeping this brief for the sake of Q&A, the last thought is just that, I wonder, so you weren't presupposing this, but I think at some point it seemed like you were saying that if a sentence supports counterfactuals, then it's a law. So supporting counterfactuals isn't necessary, but it's sufficient for logum, and that seemed to be suspicious.
Yeah,
but-
the law is supposed to
right, cool. So then it's the first two. So it's just sort of a schematic kind of defense of the BSA against these kind of criticisms, because I'm interested in sort of seeing what the strongest version would be. So I'm wondering what you have to say about that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I think some of the conjunctions, I think you're right, you might wonder how all of that is going to play out how well all that is going to fit with BSA authors. And yes, the idea with the language requirement is that you get the gerrymander, and here like the trick with Frankenstein regularities is that you just gerrymander the distributions. Right?
But it looks like the antecedent to those regularities is, yeah.
Right, and the question is could Lewis just deny that these are also nature? I think that's an option, but I think that then leads you to a position on which BSA has to deny that equations of motion are laws of nature. And because now I'm constructing something that looks similar. It's similar in all respects, except that it's Frankenstein.
Sure.
It's not held together by some underlying features that generate the regularities that a non-Humean might appeal to in counterfactual laws. So that if you think about where Lewis starts out, then the whole Humean picture, the way it's being sold to the unsuspecting public is that, look, everything that you always wanted from necessary connections, I can give you without having laws, factuals, causation, and I was going to say all the things that you always wanted to say. And I'm not quite sure that is true. And I think at this point, it's that now at the end, I have that dilemma at the end, partially to account for the line that you're pushing. Look, if BSA wants to say the laws of nature aren't that equations of motion aren't laws of nature, well, that's one option. But I think it's an unappealing anti-scientific.
We'll talk more.
Yeah. So I'm not a Humean either, but as a student of very lowers, I feel obligated to give a pitch. So one of the worries you raised, which is definitely a worry, sort of unspecified worry from like old style Lewis stuff, is how do you get things like F equals ma as laws, right? Especially you think of laws have to be expressed in something like second order predicate logic. Simplicity is governed by something like the number of logical operators you need to express this. How do you do differential equations in those terms? Things go very bad. So here's a sort of, feels like the up and coming crop of Humeans, the sort of picture they like. And this is very, very Barry inspired, which is, it's the David Albert story. You meet God, right? If you're not going to remember the conversations, they're just what can you write down in your t-shirt?
Yeah.
And to bring back to you that'll help you on the road. So what's informative? What would be informative for you? And what would be simple for you? That's the sort of relevant, so this sort of pragmatic Humean. And so some infinite long disjunction, or conjunctions, or infinite number of conditionals equal infinite number of things each side. That's not something that's informative or simple for people like us. So that wouldn't be the kind of thing, whereas an F equals ma is the kind of thing. And so that would be the kind of thing which you might ploply write down in your t-shirt. And you meet God, and God's trying to tell you helpful things about the world. So say we take that style approach. So in fact, we can ditch the appeal to perfect natural properties because we're appealing to what's simple and informative for us to do that kind of work. And you go on the sort of the David Albert, Barry Lower t-shirt picture of the best system account. So what do you think about that?
Well, okay, you make a small remark about that, Johnson. Question. I didn't talk about ethicals MA because my view that's just that's what it needs to be for, so it calls acceleration. So that's why I kind of focus on Newton's law of gravity, and also I think that's what I focus on. I think if you think about you get to see God, and what do you come back with? Well, I would think that if you go to see God, and if God did what I think he did when he made the world, what are you going to come back with is the same thing that you come back with when you go take physics class. What you come back with is you have the toolkit for writing down equations of motion. You have what God will give you, at least like in the classical universe, he'll tell you about all the force laws. And then, kind of once you have that, given any problem, you can write down equations of motion, and then, you go take a calculus class and figure out and solve differential equations, and that's then how you do it. So that's a view on what you come back with is what Feynman thinks is a law, namely Newton's law of gravitation, that's Coulom's law, stuff like that. But then you run into the problem that I think Gabrielle was absolutely right. These do not describe regularities in our world. They only describe regularities in this, like, in those barren worlds, we just have a proton and an electron and nothing else, where you wouldn't pass the strength threshold. So I think your story is absolutely right. I'm not quite sure it supports the Humean account rather than some version of a governing conception of law on which Newton's laws are actually laws. I mean, it's like in the background of this paper that Newton's law is doing this work, and I don't really have an account of what it does and how it does it. Beyond now you actually figure out how stuff moves and what.
Barry would certainly agree that the world is just a proton and electron. Those aren't the laws.
Yeah.
There just aren't any laws.
So and also kind of with the other aspect is that I think this whole stuff about balancing strength and simplicity, I think that's probably true. So that there might well be a necessary condition for law. But I'm not sure it's a sufficient one because precisely because of forms like when you get a Lawless, where you can have these strand regularities, they seem to be missing something. They don't support counterfactuals. Yet on the face of it, they seem to look like what you get when you do the picture starting out with Newton's laws and then write down the equations of motion and forget everything that came before. You forget how you got the equations of motion in the first place. Just look at the regularities. You can get something like that, the Frankenstein regularity in Lawless laws. But I think it supports counterfactuals, and I think it's a law. But BSA must claim it is a law because it's a regularity theory of law. So that would be my. I think we largely agree on this.
So we have two more questions, so I'm going to try to move through them.
Thanks. I was just thinking, as a move in the dialectic, and I wouldn't want to support it, but at least to give Lewis a bit better response when you're appealing to Goodman's view.
Yeah.
Where you said, well, Lewis could bite the bullet, but that's too big a price to pay. Perhaps the story behind Goodman's view could be reformulated such that really what we don't want to be the case is that accidental generalizations support counterfactuals better than laws. We don't want that to be the case. And that's a weaker view than his view, but at least that's the worry that we might have. You don't want to be misguided by using regularities. Or at least Lewis could say there, fine, because that's still the case in these lawless worlds. There's just no counterfactuals which are true anyway, so you won't be misled by using accidental generalizations, and at least that's been preserved. It's a bit closer to Goodman than completely biting the bullet.
Yeah, I think that's true. And that clearly, if you think about the case I made against Lewis, that's clearly the weakest spot. Right? That Lewis would just say, well, look, I'm just going to give up on the connection about that. Or just make it as I like the sliding scale. Some laws do and others don't. And he's in that case, I don't think he's gonna run into knockdown argument. You know, he's gonna have one. But I think it's the problem is going to be more one that it's going to undermine the popularity of the best system. I think a lot of people went in it thinking that they didn't really have to give up much. In particular, they didn't have to give up much in terms of what they thought about the relation between laws and counterfactual. I mean, on the face, I don't know what you think, but on the face of it, that grounds the idea that the defining feature of laws of nature, is just the logical work they do in kind of shortening a description. That's a structure that's utterly implausible, but that's really something you have to lean on if you want to kind of dismiss the connection between laws and counterfactual. So you can do it, it's a brilliant picture, and Lewis was around us, he would kind of explain how it's all really good, all the words are there, but I think it might reduce the appeal of the BSA. But that's, I completely agree with you that there's plenty of wiggle room there.
Cool. So my original question, I think, was Chris's, but I'll ask a different question. There is this literature on that your talk was a cool complement to about there seem to be worlds with laws that the Humean doesn't find, like, and you're saying there's worlds without laws and they actually do find them. So a lot of discussion of like Michael Tooley kind of examples of 10 particles, any pair interact except one pair never interacts in the history of the universe. We can imagine different laws that govern that. The Humean will never find that. And so there's like a mini literature on those kinds of examples, and the Humean says, oh, those are question-begging intuitions because that only, you're assuming that laws govern, and that's only the only reason you think that there are laws there when the Humean says there aren't. And so you're saying there's this complement thing where intuitively there are no laws, and the Humean says there are laws. To what extent do you think the Humean responses in that first literature parallel this, that your intuitions in these kinds of cases assume a kind of governing possession of laws that are question-begging? Do you think the same dialogue plays out for those kinds of cases, or do you think something is new added by considering this sort of reverse kind of case?
Well, hold on. In the other cases, if you're an anti-Humean, you always have the problem that humans are this movable target because they're never really talking about strength and simplicity, right? So we can always tell our own story, depending on the circumstances. So I think here it's less sensitive to that, because at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter where the strength threshold is, for example. And the only way that strength and simplicity stuff comes in here is that there's in BSA you're gonna have some threshold of that time. Right? And there are other cases where then you might appeal to intuition. The case of barren worlds. As I said, well, one drawback of the strength threshold is that you can't have these barren worlds which are any laws just because of what's happening. But they kind of clearly appeal to my intuition about what the laws would be in that circumstance. And you might think, look, here we're physicists, and they think about the world, the laws of the action world, and now they look at a world in which there just have two particles. And of course, there are important reasons why they look at these worlds, because the two-particle problem is the only case where we can find precise solutions, right? So it's like for theoretical reasons, these are very important laws. But you might think McKenna makes a point in discussion about the messy counterfactuals. Is that just so here we're in the actual world and we look at the counterfactual world, in which electrons just like our electrons, and protons just like our protons, and they do the same thing that they do in the actual world, but it's just two of them. That in that counterfactual situation, that the laws would be the same as in the actual world. The human might and ought just to deny that. So I think in that case. Human is in the business that you're appealing to a non-human conception of law, and to get that off the ground. But I hope that with the Frankenstein laws, you don't need any of it. Right? All you really need is acceptance and equations of motion in broadly that modular form that we're talking about, they count as, they have to count as laws of nature for BSA unless BSA turns out to be this ridiculous anti-scientific account. And I mean, the whole promise of the account is to be like closely looks at what scientists actually do and figure out which regulates the law at the time. So I hope that so that it's kind of not similar, that it doesn't rely on intuition.
Can you ask the question if you were at time?
I could, but I'm having a
Okay, great, then.
Also, I don't know.